I received a phone call from Eric in Terre Haute, Indiana. Very interesting guy. He's by profession a orchestra instructor for a junior high school. That's got to be a tough job. And he's also a blacksmith. And he likes furniture, and he's kind of getting into that and starting to do some furniture repair. Very nice conversation. And he asked me about veneer. He was interested in it, but didn't know very much about it and kind of picked my brain. I thought that would make a good episode of Working at Woodworking. My name is Roger Kugler, and I am here to help you take your skills in woodworking out into the community to solve their problems. Help your neighbor fix a chair, build a table, maybe bookcases, or an outdoor bench. So I am not an expert at veneering, far from it, but I have done my share. So I'll pass on what I know, and I'll also add some resources in the show notes that if you're interested, and I do hope you are, you can expand your knowledge and get into this great technique. So what is veneer? Veneering in woodworking is simply taking thin pieces of wood and gluing them to something. Typically that's wood, plywood, MDF. It could be glass, it could be brass, it could be steel. There's all kinds of different ways that you can use veneer. If you do any inlay, that technically is veneering. And we'll get into the specifics a little bit later. Why should you get into veneering? Well, for number one, it is absolutely gorgeous. You have all seen veneered furniture. Things that don't look like you felled a tree, sliced it up, put some finish on it, and called it a dining room table. No, this stuff is intricate, it is fascinating, and it is just absolutely gorgeous. Another reason to consider veneering is cost savings. I'm evaluating one product line that I may switch from solid wood to veneered wood, simply because it's getting so hard to get good quality solid wood in this species that if I can get a good source of veneer and work out the production of that, I may very well switch over. And quite frankly, there's just some species that you're not going to buy a 1x10 in. And even if you could find it, you probably couldn't afford it. Could you imagine building a small secretary out of solid ebony? Oh my gosh, the thing would weigh a ton, and it would probably cost you a ton. That stuff is not cheap, but you could do that in ebony veneer at a somewhat reasonable price. Creativity. You can do things with veneer that you simply cannot do with solid wood. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And one that I think we should give some very serious consideration to as a reason to get into veneering is conservation. If you use a 3/4 piece of hardwood to build something out of a very expensive, maybe rare piece of wood, that is it. That's the only thing that piece of wood is ever going to do. That one piece is all it's ever going to manifest itself into. But if you could take that piece of wood and slice it into very, very thin pieces, you could cover a whole bunch of furniture with that same piece of wood. In the U.S., we typically make veneer either 1/40th, 1/42nd of an inch thick. It kind of varies from plant to plant. But if you think of having an inch thick board and getting 40 or 42 slices out of that, that's pretty incredible. So you could take one board foot of wood and turn it into 42 board feet of veneer. That's larger than a sheet of plywood. So from a conservation side, this makes a lot of sense. The other reason to get into veneer, well, it's tradition. It's historical. King Tut's tomb actually his coffin, was veneered with hide glue. Yeah, the entire thing. King Tut, 4,000 years ago or so? So this technique has been around a while. The Chinese were fantastic artists using veneer. French marquetry, everyone has heard of that. Early American furniture, Chippendale, Whipplewhite, extensively used veneers. You've probably heard of the Bombay bow front dresser, this kind of curvy serpentine dresser that I don't think other than the top has a straight line in it. That is all done with veneers and stacked block technique. Then we kind of move into mid-century modern, the furniture that was being produced after World War II, and things kind of take a dark turn when it comes to veneer. At that time, they were experimenting a lot with different types of substrates, particularly particle board and chipboard, which turns out makes an absolutely horrible substrate for veneer. And so we got a lot of furniture that, well, quite frankly, it just blew up. You know, if you get a drop of water on it, the core would just tear itself apart. And veneer got a really bad reputation in the United States from that. A lot of really cheap furniture, just not well done at all. And the reputation of veneer really suffered. And I think we still kind of have a little bit of that even today. Although we use a lot of veneer, which we'll talk about a little bit later. So how do you make veneer? Well, you make veneer in a veneer factory. These are great big plants, super heavy industry. It's really quite a fascinating process. So there's two ways that we can make veneer. One way is to do a rotary cut, and the second way is to do a sliced cut. The rotary cut, the logs go into a vat of boiling water. Well, not boiling. It's about 140 degrees or so. Every veneer plant has their own proprietary process, their own recipe, so to speak, depending on the species. But the logs are heated up in water about 140 degrees, and that really, really, really softens those wood fibers. It makes the ligum in the wood, the glue that holds the cells together, very, very relaxed and very, very loose. If you're making a rotary cut veneer, you position the log on, in essence, a giant lathe, and you start spinning that log, and a giant knife comes down and just starts peeling the wood off. Think of a roll of toilet paper. You start pulling the toilet paper and it just keeps pulling off and pulling off and pulling off as the diameter gets smaller and smaller. That's exactly what is happening with a rotary cut veneer. There is no waste. There is no sawdust. There is no kerf. They can slice these things down to 142nd of an inch. That's 42 pieces per inch, which is what, 0.006 thousandths of an inch, I think. You can do the math. In Europe, they are getting 1/56th of an inch, so 56 pieces per inch. And Japan, different technique, but they're getting 120. This stuff is super, super thin. I've never seen it. I've never worked with it. Frankly, it kind of scares me. I'll stick with the U.S.-made veneer. So anyway, the rotary cut veneer is primarily used for plywood. You can vary the thickness of those veneers that you're taking off. If you're building the core of a sheet of plywood, well, they may be like 1/8 of an inch thick. But the face veneers are going to be very, very thin. And then you get into the different grades. What I just described, thick core veneers between two sheets of very thin veneers will give you something like a cabinet grade, sheet of plywood. And you can get a C grade, which is like a construction grade. There are some defects in the outer cores, and the outer cores are not thin. They're a full size. A D grade is kind of an exterior. There's some voids. It's a pretty ugly piece of plywood, but if you're going to bury that in a subfloor or something like that, it has its place. Now, spoiler alert. Whenever you use a B grade cabinet, you have rotary cut face veneers. What does that mean? It means that the grain does not look like normal wood. Now, huge spoiler alert. After I learned this, I never looked at a bookcase or any type of clear finished cabinets the same. With wood grain, it primarily comes in only two flavors. It's either a straight grain with straight lines, relatively straight lines, or it's cathedral grain, such as a flat cut or a plain cut piece of wood. You get those cathedrals. But if you look at a sheet of plywood, your typical plywood, you get this weird malted, I don't even have a good word for it. It's unnatural. It's X-Files. It just doesn't look like real wood, which it is real wood, but it's unnaturally cut, so to speak. So go into your friend's house and look at their kitchen cabinets, and the face panel may very likely be rotary cut plywood veneer, and it just looks odd. It looks funny if you know what to look for. For all of you that are going to be traumatized by this, I apologize. It's just the way some plywoods come, but not all plywoods. You can also get sliced veneer. And here, they take that log out of the super hot water, and they place it on a fixture, and a knife comes down and slices a very thin piece of veneer off of that log. And there's a number of different ways that it can be sliced. It can be plain sliced or flat sliced, just like running it through a band mill. It can be quartered. It can be riffed. It can be half round sliced. That's where they cut the log into quarters and then mount a quarter of a log onto a mechanism that rotates it through a knife. It's kind of like rotary cutting a quarter of a log. And the advantage of that is that you maintain that grain structure and with very, very consistent grain patterns throughout the entire quarter of that log. It's a fascinating industry. If you ever get a chance to tour a veneer plant, it's really, really, really interesting. So the advantage of sliced veneer is that you don't get that weird grain pattern. It looks like a real piece of wood. It looks like a board that you would pick up at your hardwood supplier. These slices go into making A-grade plywood or architectural plywood. And it can be really, really cool because whenever they slice these sheets of veneer off the log, they keep it in sequence, in a flitch, so that all that grain pattern stays intact. So you can take two pieces of veneer that are one on top of the other and position them in all kinds of different orientations to get different effects. You've probably heard of book matched. That's how they do that. And you can get some absolutely gorgeous, gorgeous patterns that way. Now, another way that you can get veneer is make it yourself. You have a nice piece of, tiger striped maple, just absolutely gorgeous, and you have a bandsaw, bingo. You can slice that off at 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little thinner. If you really fall down into the rabbit hole of hand veneer making, then you're going to use a bow saw and a series of different planes to finish out the veneer. And there are people who do this, so I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, some veneer you can get with a backing. Typically, when you buy veneer, it's just that piece of wood. It's that thin, thin piece of wood. And it is still wood, so it's going to move. And a lot of times you'll pick up a stack of veneer and the ends will be split. There'll be cracks in it, and you have to learn to work with that. You can also buy paper-backed veneer, where they adhere that veneer to a sheet of paper, kind of like what we do with drywall, and you can use it that way. The veneer is much more stable. It doesn't move on you. It can be easier to work with on some projects. Other projects, it might actually be a hindrance. You can also get paper-backed veneer that has like a pressure-sensitive adhesive, a PSA adhesive on it. So you peel off the release sheet and use a J-roller and roll that onto your substrate, and boom, you're done. So what about substrates? Well, back in the old days, they used wood because that's what they had. And depending on the furniture, the time period, the country of origin, the technique, it could be anything from a solid piece of wood. Yeah, that's going to move. Or sometimes people would make their own plywood. They would saw out sheets of thin material, maybe a 1/4 inch thick, and glue that up in, a cross orientation to try to stabilize that wood movement, and then apply the veneer on top of that. Modern day, you can use a good quality plywood. Probably not a D grade plywood, but, a nice B would work just perfectly fine. A lot of people are using MDF, medium density fiberboard. This is in essence sawdust, this actually sawdust powder that they mix resins with, put it in a great big press with heat and pressure, and they come out with this medium density fiberboard. The fiber being the cellulose from the wood. Very flat, pretty heavy, fair resistance to moisture. Not as bad as the old particle boards, but still not great. But for certain applications, it would be perfectly good to use. I would say probably most veneering now is people are using MDF because it is so flat, so smooth, and stable. It's not going to move on you. What do you use for the glue whenever you're veneering? Well, that kind of depends on how you are adhering the veneer to the substrate. You have probably seen in some woodworking catalogs what's called a veneer press. This looks like a kind of a medieval torture device with a whole bunch of screws that are designed to screw a platen down evenly onto a piece of veneer that's been placed in it. I don't see that used a whole bunch anymore, except maybe for some very specialized, projects. Typically now people are using vacuum presses, and vacuum presses are really, really cool. You, in essence, get a big plastic bag and suck all the air out of it. And whenever you suck that air out of it, you allow the air pressure of our atmosphere, 15.7 pounds per square inch, to come down and push down your veneer into the substrate, getting a really good glue bond and just waiting for the glue to cure. These don't have to be terribly elaborate processes. In fact, if you ever go into Harbor Freight, you'll see the clothing storage bags. These are kind of a weird plastic bag that the mouth opens and there's a double Ziploc seal and a valve, and you hook that up to your home vacuum cleaner and it sucks all the air out, and again, atmospheric pressure crushes your clothes into about roughly half the volume. I've used them for years. You can also use those same bags and your shop vac to do veneering. Now, it's not perfect because you're not maintaining that pressure, but in my experience, I've done some very good, veneer jobs using that. I check on it maybe every 15 minutes after I take the initial vacuum on it. There's a one-way valve in the bag so that once you suck all the air out and remove the vacuum, it just doesn't, rush out. It's locked in there. But the bags are not perfect, and you will start to lose a little bit of that vacuum. You just put your shop vac attached to it again and take another draw, and it maintains that vacuum. You actually don't need that much vacuum to do it, so you're probably not getting a full 15.7 psi, but even 10 psi, is going to give you a good clamp for that until that glue dries. If you want more information on vacuum bagging, probably the best source is veneersupplies.com, link in show notes. They have everything. If you want to buy a vacuum pump, they sell them. Typically, you're looking for maybe $500. If you want to make your own vacuum pump, you can either buy, I think they sell kits or they sell plants that you can build your own vacuum pump. These pumps are unique in that they have a pressure regulator that maintains that vacuum within a certain range. So kind of like your air compressor. The pressure in your air compressor drops to a certain PSI, it kicks on and repressurizes the air tank. The same thing, except in reverse. The pressure gets so high and it kicks on and it takes more of a vacuum. I buy my vacuum bagging materials from Jamestown Distributors in Rhode Island. It's more of a marine supply store. In boat building, vacuum bagging comes in very, very handy, for adhering, for building, different pieces and different parts. If you ever want to get into like bent lamination, furniture building, things like that, this is where vacuum bagging really, really shines. There's a whole range of uses for vacuum bagging techniques in woodworking. The third way that you can get into veneering, if your head is spinning from all this talk about vacuum bagging, is to use a hammer veneer technique. Yeah, we're going old school here. You're breaking out the hide glue, putting it in the pot, letting it heat up to around 140 degrees, and taking your veneer, flipping it to the backside, your glue brush, coating the veneer, coating the substrate, putting the veneer onto the substrate, grabbing your veneer hammer, which it's not a hammer in the sense that we strike the veneer, but it's more of a pusher or maybe a scraper. It's a squeegee, honestly, is what it is. It has a metal face to it, and it's kind of heavy so that we can get some work out of it. And you squeegee the veneer, forcing the excess glue out between the veneer and the substrate, and being hide glue, as soon as that starts to cool off, it starts to become tacky, and then it starts to become hard. Hide glue is a wonderful thing to work with in woodworking. If you haven't done it, maybe I should do an episode. Explore hide glue. It can be a huge benefit in the shop. One of the neat things about hide glue is it's kind of the first CA glue. It's the instant bond, because it does not take very long to reach a full tack state where these two pieces are not going to move any longer. To reach full bond, you need about 24 hours, but you can glue something up and give it 10 minutes and start working with it. Hide glue is wonderful. And we've only been using it for, 4,000 or 5,000 years. So anyway, hammer veneering I think is very easy. It's what I do most of the time. Sometimes I'll break out the vacuum bags, but typically, especially if you're doing like a coffee table, or I had a sideboard and that was a copy of George Washington sideboard. It was built in 1934, not very far from where I grew up actually, as a kind of a celebration, something at the White House. I forget all the details. And the top was destroyed. It was gone. It was a mahogany veneer, and people would put plants on it, and of course plants, pee all over the place, and it was trashed. And I used a paper-backed mahogany veneer to replace the original veneer, and it worked very, very well with hide glue. One of the neat things about hide glue is you can reheat it and reposition things. And there was a couple spots that I didn't get good glue adhesion, and I was able to use an ordinary, clothes iron. Well, it's not ordinary because my wife made me buy her a new one after I used hers to do some edge banding, which, pro tip, if you're married and you're using household equipment, plan on replacing the household equipment that you use in a workshop with brand new, or go out and buy something at a, junk store, secondhand store, and save a little bit of money and a whole bunch of hassle. Just saying. So anyway, with the iron, I can reheat that area and use the hammer veneer and get that to re-adhere. And it works out very, very well. And if you'd like more information on how to do that, link in a show note to a wonderful YouTube channel by Steve Hay over in Australia. Thank you, all you, Aussies listening to the program. Really appreciate it. And he does a wonderful job of explaining kind of like all things veneering. And it's not as hard as you think. So, what can you veneer? What do you do with this? Pretty much anything. There are so many different things that you could veneer. I have this cheap little IKEA storage cabinet. It's kind of like an office desk cabinet. We bought it years ago at IKEA. It's actually made out of really good Baltic birch plywood. With the price of Baltic birch, maybe I should harvest. No, I can't do that. But it's Baltic birch plywood. It's not going to impress anyone. But what if I took this little cabinet and covered it in veneer? I could turn something that cost us probably, $20 20 years ago into something really quite special. If you're building a sideboard, a credenza, something like that, you could apply veneer to the drawers and give that a really different look. Just an idea. I have always wanted to build a kitchen with veneered paneled doors. I mean, we have those now, but it's always, white oak, red oak, cherry or something like that as the door panel. But what if you used, something really exotic and did like a, 4-panel book match in that? You could even use different wood species on different doors. I think that would be so cool. You could build a table out of poplar and cover it with mahogany or teak veneer or pretty much anything, zebra wood, lace wood, bloodwood. That would be expensive and it would turn brown. So, maybe not. Maybe you like the look of tiger stripe maple and you either can't find it or you can't afford it. You could use tiger stripe maple veneer and just make all kinds of things, or use just a little bit of it as an accent. Another idea I think you could do is picture frames, using different veneers to build a picture frame. And the secret here is to make one piece of wood with veneers and then cut that into the frame. Don't try to build a frame and then veneer. That is a nightmare, speaking from experience. And one of the other great things about using veneer, and, well, honestly, the one that I probably practice the most, is you can use veneer to fix your mistakes. I was building some built-in storage cabinets for a school teacher, and she was into butterflies. And I forget the exact details. This was like decades ago, but I screwed up on one corner of the top of the storage cabinet, and I think it was one of those nightmares that we get where we're attaching the tabletop or the cabinet top, and instead of picking up the 1.25" screws, we pick up the 1.5" screws. Yeah, you've had that nightmare too, haven't you? And poof, right through the top of this thing. Ah! Well, that's a great big sheet of plywood. I really don't want to replace that. So you fill in the hole with a little bit of, putty, and you find some veneer, contrasting wood, and since she is really into butterflies, you make a butterfly and inlay that over your mistake. She comes in, sees the cabinets, absolutely loves them, then sees the little butterfly inlaid into the top. Oh, that is so beautiful. And you just casually add, yeah, I knew that you were into butterflies. I thought I'd just add a little something special to it. Never admit your mistakes. Okay, here's another idea. Refinishing kitchen cabinets. They say that the average lifespan of a kitchen cabinet is about 14 years. And this comes from, people buying and selling homes. They move into a new home. They're not wild about the cabinets. They want something, an upgrade, so to speak. Sometimes that is an entire gut job, back to bare studs and rebuilding the kitchen. Sometimes that is just changing the look of the kitchen cabinets. And one way that you can change the look of kitchen cabinets is by refacing them. Remember the PSA paper-backed veneer that I talked about earlier? Yeah, you can buy this and recover kitchen cabinets with it. In fact, there's an entire industry that has grown up around this. I can remember my parents having our kitchen cabinets refaced back in the mid-70s. And of course they used this plastic laminate stuff that it looked okay, but it was like plastic laminate. But some people want their painted cabinets to look like wood cabinets. And styles always change, fortunately. Keeps us employed. And this is a great technique for doing that. It's not rocket science. There's a couple, tricks that you need to learn, and it can be very economical for the homeowner. They can get a totally different look in their kitchen for way less than the cost of new kitchen cabinets. So check that out. There are several companies that are into that. They're selling the veneer, they're selling the tools, and I even think there's a couple franchise companies that you can buy into. And of course, if you're into furniture repair, furniture restoration, you're going to need to know veneer, because a lot of furniture is veneered and you're going to need to know how to fix that. One of the questions was sand through. Yeah, I've had that nightmare too. Sanding through veneer is no fun. Speaking from experience here, it will ruin your day, quite frankly. It just pretty much blows up your entire day. It's really hard to fix. I had one customer who wanted some oil stains taken out of a teak table, and they assured me that it was solid teak. 100% positive it was solid teak. Guess what? It wasn't solid teak. It was a very good job of making a veneered kitchen tabletop, but it was not solid teak. And yes, I sanded through it. I was able to use the coloring techniques that I've always, pushed for you to learn to cover up the mistake, but it wasn't invisible. And the husband noticed it, and I did admit that, yes, I screwed that up. Probably should have put a inlay in there. And he was fine with it because he thought it was solid technique, and it's like, no, this is not solid teak. This is veneered teak. And anyway, don't sand through veneer. And if you have that sinking little feeling down in the gut, put away the sander. Get out the sanding block. We're not talking about removing, a quarter of an inch of material when we're sanding. We're just taking 1/2 thousandths of an inch away. And you can do that just as easily with a sanding block and a piece of sandpaper and your arm as you can with a random orbit sander. Also consider scrapers. A really sharp scraper can take off just the tiniest sliver of wood under control, probably all you need to do. In furniture repair, you'll come across broken veneer, missing pieces of veneer, cracked veneer, and you need to learn how to fix that and how to repair that. Now, here's something interesting. Really high-priced luxury cars, a lot of them have wood paneling on the inside. Not much, just a little panel on the door that is some exotic burl. And I had a guy who bought and sold Jaguar wood panels. Yeah, I'm not making this up. It's really interesting the way these things were made. And he would buy these things in various conditions and bring them to me, and I would renew the finish on them. It was kind of a pain in the butt and finally stopped. But that is a way of using veneer, and maybe that's something you could, get into. That was very much a place where you needed those finishing skills, the color skills, using the pigments, using the dyes, things like that. Because many times the especially with burl, it's gone. It's just not there, and you're not going to get another piece to replace that. So you have to be very, very creative in how you repair that. Now, you've probably heard of the term parquetry. Parquetry is a way of using veneer in a geometric pattern to create something, spectacular. You have heard of a parquet floor, right? Not the butter. But parquet flooring was all the rage in like the 20s and the 30s, the Art Deco period, and it kind of sprung up here and there. We see it still in a lot of high-end homes. People want something a little different in their flooring than just a area rug. And there's a gentleman in the next community to me. He makes his living doing high-end flooring using inlays and parquetry techniques. Gorgeous, gorgeous work. And of course, you've probably heard of marquetry. Marquetry is a technique of, painting a picture with wood. And the French were incredibly good at this, where they would take different colors of wood, different species of wood, and cut them into very, very, very tiny pieces and build a painting out of wood. Fascinating techniques. And that's a rabbit hole within a rabbit hole. Now, don't confuse this with intarsia. Intarsia is basically doing the same thing, but instead of using veneer, they're using whole chunks of wood. Solid wood. So an intarsia piece might be, 3/4 of an inch thick, 1.5 inches thick, or some of them, can get really wild. They'll be, 4 inches or 6 inches thick, a very three-dimensional, pattern, where the marquetry is purely a two-dimensional picture. Okay, I have pretty much exhausted my knowledge of veneering, and if you are into this or interested, you need to find someone way more knowledgeable than I am. And I have a few recommendations for you. Number one, Scott Grove. He has a YouTube channel and a business called imaginegrove.com. And there's a link in the show notes to one of his many, many, many videos. He's a very productive, very skilled, incredible veneer artist. He does a lot of really high-end work. He sells different tools for veneering. He's written some books on veneering. He offers classes. He teaches, various places. Definitely need to check him out. One of the unique things about veneering, especially when we get into the decorative veneering, is that it's kind of mind-bending because we're working with wood and we know what wood should look like, but when we start to veneer with wood, we can make it do things that wood doesn't normally do, and it kind of, bends the mind a little bit whenever we see wood doing stuff that wood doesn't do. Anyway, Scott is really good at that, and he's really, really good at teaching these techniques. Another person is Mark Adams. He's the one that kind of got me into veneering. I've taken, a couple classes from him, and there's a link to one of his YouTube videos. Mark has the innate ability of making seemingly difficult subjects very easy to understand. And I think you'll appreciate that. Mark is also very big into Disney, and he's done, a lot of Disney characters and things like that. Paul Church is an absolute master veneer artist. He's in, I think, Santa Monica, California. And I was just reading the other day where he is getting into fashion, women's fashion. He is taking cloth-backed veneer and making dresses out of this. Really, really wild. Also kind of really interesting. It's kind of almost a fish scale style. So it just kind of shows you that you can do almost anything with veneer. And the other person you need to study is Patrick Edwards in San Diego. A very interesting guy. He's old school. He studied in France, and very interesting stories. If you can catch him on some podcast where he's been interviewed, very, very interesting story. He started out as a nuclear scientist, and I guess that didn't work out for him. So he got into furniture repair and into veneering and into marquetry. He sells his own glue, hide glue. Very interesting guy. You definitely need to study him. And then there's Silas Koff. This is a gentleman that really excels at marquetry in the most profound way. He's kind of the Norman Rockwell of marquetry. He obviously has a great sense of humor because a lot of his pieces he puts himself into figuratively. And check him out. There's a link to a YouTube video on him, and very, very, very interesting professional. And of course, I mentioned Steve Hay with the hammer veneering technique from Down Under. And I mentioned the vacuum veneer supplies for all of your needs, not sponsored, unfortunately, and Jamestown Distributor. Missed jobs this week. Kitchen cabinet doors. A lady moved into a new home. Well, new home to her. It's an old home. And I guess some of the kitchen cabinet doors were just pretty much trashed. Unfortunately, I can't take on anything new right now, and I had to pass. She was very understanding. But maybe I would have had a chance to do some veneering on those. And I received an email from a lady who had bought a storage cabinet online. It was kind of mid-century modern. The doors had cane on them, but she said it was just such poor quality. She couldn't use it. She wanted something like that, but nicer, well made. And again, I can't take that on. So that work is out there. If you are able to do that, hang your shingle up and start making some money, either maybe full-time or part-time. Now, speaking of sponsorships, I don't have any, but still trying to make a little bit of money to pay the server. I have been a big fan of Skillshare for a number of years. This is an online learning platform. They offer all kinds of classes, photography, computer design. If you want to learn to build your own website, there are classes on there that can teach you to do that. It's $99 a year. You can take unlimited classes. Not only you, but your entire family. I think it's like $99 a year, but if you use the coupon code in the show notes, you can get 30% off. And also, if you are still struggling with your communications, your phone system, check out Unitel Voice over IP. Did an entire episode on this, and they have very reasonable rates, and they are the company I would pick if I was starting a new business and needed a new phone number, something that was versatile and convenient and not very expensive. So thank you for listening, and as always, feel free to give me a call. Love to chat with you. You folks give me ideas on episodes to do, and I really, really appreciate that. So until next time, happy woodworking.